All right. Since people are joining and getting logged in, I want to just welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon. I hope you are staying safe and cool this summer. It is my pleasure to welcome you to an exciting discussion on the intersection of Black internationalism and China, led by Tennessee State University Professor Keisha Brown. I'll let our moderator, Kori Cooper, do the honors of fully introducing Professor Brown. But before I turn things over to her, a few housekeeping notes, and I'll also briefly introduce Kori herself. We're Young China Watchers, Washington, D.C. and New York. We're holding this call over Zoom today, so you should find yourself currently muted. And I ask you to stay on mute if you discover that you can unmute yourself. Until we open up for the Q&A portion of the call of the discussion. When we do that, you will be invited to raise your little virtual hand next to the participant list, next to your name, and you can join then the virtual queue that Kori and I will be managing. Kori will take some questions from the floor, and we've allocated a lot of time today for discussion, so I look forward to those questions, and I really hope this is a participatory event. On that note, we do welcome you to turn on your video and show your face. I find it creates a much more personal atmosphere. Young China Watchers is very much an organization that seeks to build people-to-people ties. It's a little weird for us to be all digital. So these days when we're forced to have more virtual engagements, I find the video is really helpful. Finally, I also want to note that today's discussion is recorded, and we'll be posting it on the Young China Watchers website. So if you miss anything, you want to go back and hear anything, we welcome you to go there. Should be up later this week or next week. I'll now turn it over to Kori. Kori Cooper is currently a JD candidate and Davis Polk Leadership Fellow at Columbia Law School. Before arriving in New York, she was a Mellon Mays undergraduate fellow in Chicago and a young ambassador for the Carnegie Tsinghua Center in Beijing. She graduated with a BA in English Lit and Chinese Language and Culture from Northwestern University in 2018. She's published articles commenting on the intersection of international law and race, including a forthcoming piece with the Columbia Law Review. Last year, she founded Black Voices on Greater China, a project focused on amplifying Black voices and perspectives in the field of China studies. And I encourage you to follow that project on Twitter at BLK Voice on China. And you can follow Kori at Cooper_Esquire. With that, I will turn it over to you, Kori.
大家好. I'm so excited to be here with everyone. Thank you for that introduction, Will. I'm also really pleased to be able to introduce today's star guest, Professor Keisha Brown. Professor Keisha Brown is an assistant professor of history at Tennessee State University in the Department of History, Political Science, Geography, and Africana Studies. She graduated with her bachelor's degree from the University of Notre Dame, earned her doctorate from the University of Southern California, and was a 2018 to 2019 postdoctoral fellow at the James Weldon Johnson Institute for the Study of Race and Difference at Emory University. Dr. Brown is an Asian Studies scholar with a regional focus on East Asia, specializing in modern Chinese history. Her research and teaching interests include comparative East Asian histories, post-colonial theory, transnational studies, world history, and race and ethnic studies. Dr. Brown's research examines networks of difference in China used to understand the Black foreign other through an investigation of the social and political context that African Americans navigated and negotiated during their time in Maoist China. Her publication, Blackness in Exile, W.B. Du Bois' role in the formation of representations of Blackness as conceptualized by the Chinese Communist Party, analyzes W.E.B. Du Bois' performativity of race in China. Dr. Brown is currently extending her research on Sino-African American transnational relations to examine ideas of race and ethnicity and Afro-Asian diasporic connections, as evidenced by her blog post, Teaching China Through Black History, with the Harvard University Fairbanks Center. An essay, Bridging the Gap, Blackness and Sino-African Relations, and an essay, Bridging the Gap, Blackness and South African Relations, with the International Institute for Asian Studies. So with that, I now turn it over to Professor Brown.
Good afternoon, good evening. Thank you so much, Kori, for the introduction. Thank you to the Young China Watchers organizations, both the DC and the New York branches, for inviting me to speak today on this topic that I've been researching for quite some time. So thank you again for the invitation, and I hope that my remarks today lead to a fruitful discussion about some of these topics as it relates to Black internationalism, both historically, but also what are some lessons we can use to apply to what's happening globally right now in terms of thinking about race, redressing some issues of race. We're in this moment of kind of critical reflection globally. So with that, I'll kind of get started and kind of frame my talk today. Today, I'm primarily focusing on looking at African Americans, looking at it through this kind of US-China large bilateral relations framework, to think about how we think about Black internationalism to kind of lead us up to towards the end, thinking through Black Lives Matter in Hong Kong protests, a kind of question I was also asked to engage with as well. So while my research is venturing more towards looking at the African diaspora in general, this talk today will be more so focused on African Americans, but we can maybe broach the questions about the larger China in the world or China US in the world questions in the Q&A based upon today's particular comments and thoughts. Okay. So with that, I get started. Am I talking too fast? Is it good? I have a tendency to really go really fast. I get excited, but I'll try to keep it at a good speed just so I don't, don't lose anything in my rapid speed talking. So I want to think about what is Black internationalism. It's a large and loaded term, and one of the best definition is from Keisha Brown and Tiffany Gill's edited anthology, To Turn the Whole World Over, that focuses particularly on Black women's internationalism. And they mention a few key components of what Black internationalism is. First, it's about the global visions of Black people in the US and other parts of the diaspora. So these kind of global visions of envisioning the world from this particular Black diasporic viewpoint. It's also about trying to forge transnational and transracial collaborations and solidarities of people with people of color from various parts of the world. So while they're coming from very much this kind of Black diasporic background understanding and looking beyond their own particular, say, local or national or state identities and spaces, they're trying to forge some kind of larger collaborations with other people, people of color, particularly around the world. It also has global, historical, political, intellectual, and also artistic aspects as well. So we can think about some of the artistic movements that have also been spurred from this as well. So it's not just the intellectual or the political, but there's also other components to it as well that we see in some of the larger kind of transnational movements. And it's also another point is where it's this collective struggle to really think about how to combat and to overthrow white supremacy, global white supremacy in all of its forms. So how it's impacting me and my particular background as, say, African American in the US versus someone whom identify as Black in France, but also how there's multiple manifestations. So not just my own individual experience, but how can we overthrow these larger systems of oppression that are really in some ways impacting us at a larger level? How do we kind of in some ways dig into these issues of oppression, systematic ways of dealing with some of these larger issues? And we're going to kind of come back to that last point about overcoming and combating systematic global white supremacy when we talk more about Afro-Asian networks. But before we get to Afro-Asian networks, let's take a step back. We talk about Black internationalism. What is Black? We might know internationalism, we might know have an understanding what we mean by international, but what do we mean by Black or Blackness? And from this perspective and thinking through a definition for Blackness, I turn to Michelle Wright's work, Physics of Blackness. I love this book. If you haven't had a chance to read it, it's really good. She has some really good work. This is, I think, her second book. Her first book, Becoming Black, is also really good as well. But in this text, she gives some flexibility. A lot of times in the work that deals with Blackness, it becomes so singular. They're trying to figure out what Blackness is. They try to pigeonhole one particular identity where they start to pigeonhole some of the work or some of the narratives themselves, or trying to open up spaces by trying to identify what Black is, actually do the same work as other narratives have done before. And so in her scholarship, she says, let's move away from what is Blackness, because what Blackness is, or Black identity, like other identities, changes over time. It's malleable. How you see yourself at one point might be different from another point. For example, Du Bois, he went to China more than once. He went in the 1930s, went back in the 1950s. How he saw himself in relation to China changed both of those times. And so again, as he started to think through his own experiences and the world around him, the changing context, his identity, while some of the core parts remain, his understanding of himself in the world also in some ways changed as well. So identity can be flexible. Think about your own experience. Are you the same as you were when you were 15? Let's be real. Are we all the same as we were in January? Because January to now has been some tough months. So think about yourself, what you learned about yourself, even in this year, how that has in some ways changed how you see or think about your own understanding about your identity. It might in some ways strengthen the different core values you hold, or it might have also challenged some things you think about yourself as well. And so she moves away from what as this kind of singular identity to focus on the when and the where. And it gives some flexibility in terms of how do we think about Blackness? How is it expressed? And the when and the where gives us these two major points. Context, what's happening around us. As a historian, I'm always about context, context, context. My students probably get tired of me saying context matters, but it does, because the context in some ways gives you a different understanding of how you see yourself and the world around you. So what's happening in that moment can also reshape your ideas. It can reaffirm it, or it can lead to some change ideas where you think about something from a different perspective based on a different experience. And also where, it's also when. So the when and where gives us context, but also another part of it is who. Who is the individual? And this gets to the second part of talking about identity, right? Who is a person and how we think about our own identity. And identity has 2 points. One is ascribed identity. Ascribed is basically some kind of external gaze looking upon the body. How someone sees you and says, well, this is how I identify who you are based on my understanding of X, Y, and Z, based on my experiences. And so this can be physical, where someone looks at you and says, well, because you have certain physical attributes, you must identify as this particular group. So example, one time I went to China, before I went natural, I had longer hair, it was permed out. I went to a restaurant and someone thought I looked like I was from India. I don't know why they thought that, but they thought I was Indian. That was interesting to me. I was like, no, never been, but I'm glad you think I looked like India. I think Indians are beautiful. But again, it's a question of they saw me and made some assumptions about how I looked and said, well, you look this way, you must be from here. The opposite happens as well. Because I am Black, I'm also many times not seen as American. I have to in some ways put out the, yes, I am American. America has Black people in it. And so it can happen where the understanding of what a place is or who belongs in certain groups based on your physical appearance can work in different ways. It can also be stereotypes. They say, well, because I recognize you as belonging to a certain in-group, you must behave like this, you must think this way, you must believe certain things. And that can be another limiting identity where it's about someone sees you and makes assumptions that because you are this particular identity, that you must believe certain things a certain way or have certain attributes that make you something in their own mind, what you're supposed to be. And then even within a community identity, that's because, so for instance, I have 2 sisters. We're all Black women from the South, raised in the same household. Yet how we identify ourselves and how we navigate the world as Black women is different. So because we're all Black women, we have some similar identity markers, does not mean we have the same identity across the board or the same beliefs or the same ways of operating the world around us. And so that's a kind of ascribed identity that's kind of external. And then you have the self-identity, which is how you see yourself. How you identify, who am I? Who do I see myself? How do I think about myself? Do I think about in terms of geography, where I'm from? Is that important to me? Is my racial identity important? Is my gender identity? Is my religious identity? Is my sexual identity important to me? What is important to my identity as a person? And how do I see myself in the world? And so if we can see between the ascribed and the self, there is a gap. And so many cases in my research, how do I navigate that gap is through this concept of performativity, how someone engages the world around them and how in some way they fill this gap between the ascribed and the self, how someone sees you, how I see myself, and how I can engage you in a way that leads to some changes where we leave knowing a little bit more about each other at the end of this exchange, right? So performativity, you have an audience and you have a performer. And the audience is someone who you're engaging with. And it can be an individual, it can be a state, it can be an organization, but it's this idea of there's someone you're engaging with. And the audience, you have expectation. They come with some kind of understanding, identity, or whatever it may be. They come with some kind of their own kind of context. What is happening? Who is the audience and what's happening at that moment? And also, what is the takeaway? What are they leaving that exchange with? Do they have a great understanding of who you are and other understandings of yourself and other kind of things in that nature? Also, the performer. You have your self-identity, what you're putting out there, what you're willing to expose or reveal or share with those you're engaging with is also very important as well. So we think about our own selves again. How are you engaged with your friends? How you engage with your parents? Versus how you engage with your peers at work. It might be three different ways of engagement. It doesn't mean you're three different people. You're not, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. But that also means you have different ways of navigating different spaces. Know that in a professional space at work, I engage this way. I'm still the same person, but this is how we communicate in this space. This is how I get to express myself in this space. Versus with your family, you're more relaxed. You're at home, you're chilling, right? Or just the ideas of how we engage in different places and the way we identify. And it can be where in a familiar setting, you feel more comfortable in some ways, being more relaxed and more revealing, versus in a workspace, you're more in some ways kind of guarded, where I let you see some parts of me, but there's also a kind of boundary there as well. But it's also this idea of how you engage with the world as a performer and what you're choosing to do, which actions you choose to engage with in those different spaces. And so we see this gap between the ascribed and the self-identity can happen on multiple levels, and coming back to Afro-Asian networks. And it happens in these larger transnational networks as well, where you have Afro-Asian solidarity. You have the height of it really as a kind of this Bandung moment, a kind of Bandung spirit in 1955, the kind of Bandung conference, where it was leading up to that. We see kind of a start of this idea of color solidarity beginning in the late 1800s, early 1900s, especially with African Americans. Mark Gallacio, in his book, African Americans Encounter with China and Japan, 1895 to 1945, does a really good discussion of how we see these early roots, how we see it really cementing with the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905, and how we see it shifting from Japan to China in the about 1930s and 1940s, after it became too hard to blatantly ignore the ways in which Japanese imperialism was really, in some ways, damaging to other places in Asia. So we can't keep ignoring this. We had to actually realize and address, what are we looking for? Is Japan really still serving us that particular model? And so we look at these kind of moments and thinking through Black internationalism historically, but kind of Bandung was this really big moment of kind of Afro-Asian solidarity, color solidarity. You have these post-colonial moment where a lot of these countries are now becoming newly independent nation states, and they're in some ways trying to figure out how to navigate the world and how they would identify and what does that mean for them as these larger nations moving forward in terms of thinking through. And African Americans become part of this narrative. They're not a people who have their own particular country per se. They're still Americans, but they become part of this narrative and through this idea of Afro-Asian people uniting. So focusing on the people part and not necessarily just the places part. And we see speeches from Mao Zedong, who says, people in Africa, Asia, and, all over in Latin America unite. But he also has specific speeches talking to and targeting African Americans that come out in 1963 and 1968. Both kind of centered around the civil rights movement in 1963 on the eve on the March of Washington, in 1968 post Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis. So he sends these statements out. They're published every year, so you can't forget he wrote them. So the People's Daily publishes them every year. They're recirculated, and you see this language in some ways circulating in different places. It also becomes part of their foreign relations narrative, where books like Anne Marie Brady, where she talks about making the foreign serve China, engaging with African Americans to, as Mao says, to defeat American imperialism, becomes part of this larger narrative and thinking through what they're trying to do for their foreign relations agenda. But in addition to, some of these strengths are really useful in thinking through the idea of collaboration. Again, good set point of looking beyond the US, looking beyond what's here to think of some larger global transnational and transracial networks to tap into, but also how to combat global white supremacy. We see this happening as a strength of these organizations. How do we think through together in a collaborative form to engage in some of these topics? And kind of overthrow these different modes of supremacy and oppression that are happening in different spaces. It might not be the same, might not look the same, might look similar, but at the same time, there are still some kind of similarities in terms of how these modes of oppression are operating in different contexts. But there are also some limits to some of the Afro-Asian networks that we can kind of see both then and also kind of see through what's happening in some moments today. One of the weaknesses is that for African Americans in particular, thinking through the rhetoric that's coming out from places like China, is that African Americans are very much always associated with this oppression narrative. We see this kind of started early on in the early 1920s, when, actually before that, 1901, when Lin Shu translates Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it becomes this kind of text that becomes part of the Chinese drama canon. Because it's like, how is Uncle Tom's Cabin have such a long lasting legacy in China. Like, I mean, it is still, you can go to a bookstore anywhere and find a copy of a Chinese translation of the Tom's Cabin. I was like, why of all books? But it is. But what happens is it's translated around the same time as we see the kind of modern drama movement is taking off. And so we see the book being adapted to plays, and it becomes a mainstay through this through the drama artistic circles, but also becomes part of this larger narrative as well. But that's where its kind of staying power happens, where it becomes reproduced and reproduced over and over throughout the 20th century, because it becomes part of this drama circle. Become modern Chinese drama is one of the first two texts from English that are translated. It's also a Doll's House is the other one that's translated. So they chose some very happy books to translate first off. And so we think about these particular texts. And so we think about Uncle Tom's Cabin, the way in which it was translated. The problem with that translation is that it's talking about Black people, talking about slavery from not only through Harriet Beecher Stowe's eyes, but also Lin Shu's eyes as a translator. He did not read English, so the book was read to him, and then he translated what he heard. And so what happens in the translation is, one, the very heavy religious elements that Stowe puts in there are taken out. And two, the narratives of African Americans are in some ways seen as in place of those of the coolie laborers that are happening, the coolie laborers who have come from places in Asia such as China and India, who are now becoming this new exploited labor force in places in the Caribbean, and then it's also Central and South America. And so, and also in the United States itself. So this kind of coolie labor that's being this new exploited labor force coming from Asia is now in some way seen as this kind of the model of the people they're focusing on in his translation of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so the narrative of African Americans becomes almost this kind of a template, almost like a narrative, but this idea of oppression kind of comes from there. It's kind of recirculated throughout. We kind of see in many cases throughout the 20th century, the idea of Black people associated with oppression is there. The problem is that they never get beyond the oppression narrative. It's never, these are some achievements, these are some milestones that have been happening moving forward. It always comes back to oppression narrative. Even in the speeches by Mao that I mentioned, he goes through and mentions a lot of the kind of key moments of the civil rights movement, but then it comes back to, but they're still oppressed. And so even in trying to move forward, it never gets out of this model of oppression. So what does that mean for people if you do not see them beyond what is oppressing them? Can you see them beyond being oppressed people? And if not, then how does that mean they can help move this color solidarity forward? What do you think they're going to offer to you if they're only being oppressed? Also, there's a question of dialogue about race. In many cases in Asian study spaces, it still happens, and so it's increasing now, but there's not a lot of discussion about race. A lot of times, a lot of scholarship that comes out, where scholars who do this work will look into other fields. In some cases, a lot of work comes out of critical race studies that I use. A lot of other scholars use a lot of theoretical work that comes out of Asian American studies and other spaces, because within Asian studies, kind of thinking about places in Asia particularly, there's not a lot of dialogue that's happening. Shumei Sher wrote in this really great piece in PMLA, and I think it was 2008, about the idea of how we think about it in many cases in Asian studies, where it was, that's seen as something that's a derivative of the West, that's in Western places, that's not a thing that happens in Asia. And so while not addressing it, how can you have these kind of close solidarities who's not addressing the issues or questions about race? How can we talk about it? I know we're trying to be transracial, which is great, but we have to think about and address race in order to really start thinking about dismantling these systems of oppression, because it's not just white supremacy that's external. Franz Fanon in his work, Black Skin, White Mask, talks about the psychological in which a lot of these ideas are also internalized. How do we talk about internalization of this idea about the other, i.e. think about global anti-Blackness? So how do we talk about it when we don't in some ways address it or engage it, or even have a dialogue or terms to talk about it? And so that's another thing to really think about. How do we talk about race? There's some really great work coming out from other people who are using, in China, looking at mixed race individuals, thinking through ideas of concepts of blood, mixed blood, what does that mean? And other ways to kind of really try to think through it, because we don't really have a lot of terminology to really engage it without really superimposing Western ideas or Western scholarship onto a non-Western space. So how do we engage these ideas as well? And how do we have a dialogue and talk about it when we don't really have these discussions in these places? And this is something that happens in the Afro-Asian networks, and it's something that's still happening in some of these spaces as well, not really engaging in it, only focusing on the positive collaborative side and not really addressing some of the other sides, some of the limitations. And a good kind of short thing to think about, a kind of hypothetical piece is Du Bois's Dark Princess. Is a fictional text But he talks about this where his protagonist, Matthew, is at this dinner in France. He's a young student, he's a young Black man, tries to go to medical school in the US, and basically almost like blackball him where he quits. You know, they made it difficult where he couldn't register for class. They said he was underqualified. And it was like everything he tried to do, there was 2 stumbling blocks for every one achievement he made to where he was just, I'm just not dealing with it. And so he leaves, and what happens in that moment is that he goes to France, and this becomes a space where he starts to see this kind of color solidarity engaging, where he's having his dinner party, and there's someone who's a guest who's from China, one from Japan, someone from all these different places in East and Southeast Asia. And it's in this discussion, it's kind of hypothetical, where he's like, I'm here, they want me here, but at the same time he's thinking, but do they even think I have anything to offer? Because every time I try to in some way speak, I'm in some way silenced. What is happening? And so Du Bois is trying to think through this hypothetically through his fictional character, Matthew, in this particular text, Dark Princess. And it's something we're some way still trying to think through as well. Last thing, because I think I've been talking way too much, is thinking through how do we take these lessons of the Afro-Asian networks, both the strengths and some of the limitations, to really kind of address what's happening right now. A lot of the questions I've been getting recently, especially thinking through what's happening with the rising different movements and protests that are happening to combat racial injustices, not just in the US, but in other places, also kind of human rights abuses that are happening globally in the midst of kind of the COVID-19 pandemic and how we're dealing with these. And so one of the questions I get is, you know, what about Hong Kong and the Black Lives Matter? Why do we not see more, in some ways, collaboration or connection, or like what's happening in those spaces? And so one good piece that really, I think I was really happy to be a part of was David Wartime's piece in Politico not too long ago, where I'm entitled China's Wolf Warriors, More Bark Than Bite, where he tries to give a very complex layout of it's not just a simple not wanting to support or not understanding, but we have these different pockets in certain places where we have some students who are trying to, but you also have pockets where you have the Chinese media saying something else. Like there's a lot of different layers to it to kind of really think through and unpack it. And so I think for me, there are kind of 3, I guess, really interesting ways of thinking about it. Is one, we're in a very kind of nationalistic turn on both sides of this kind of US-China bilateral relations, where both sides are very much taking a nationalistic, domestic turn. And we're in an election year, which means whenever there's a presidential cycle, it really becomes more concentrated on thinking through the domestic policies. And being in a year of a pandemic and COVID-19 and how that's really impacted people is really making domestic politics for many people more focused and thinking about international. They're more focused on what are my kids going to do for the fall in terms of school? They're going to be at home or in school? What does this mean for learning? Are they going to be behind because of this? Am I going to be still able to work? Am I going to have a job? Do I have money to feed my kids? So this is a really heavy moment where people are focusing on trying to survive in it every day and not thinking really about the international in some particular ways. But I think in that kind of address the kind of both sides of leadership are focusing very much on these very domestic nationalistic moments, as well as these movements are trying to address this rhetoric from both sides. How do we address the rhetoric of you're talking about domestic issues? If this is the rhetoric we have to combat, how do we focus on this to try to get our message across? We have to engage in these conversations to really think through how to get our message out there. And it's not saying they don't endorse international support. We saw Black Lives Matter protests globally, but it's a matter of we're trying to really engage with the current administration to really get our voices out there, not just to the president, but also the local level. So for instance, the Black Lives Matter movement is not new, but it had resurgence this year where after Breonna Taylor was killed, they had a petition in Lexington, in Kentucky to get the no-knock warrant removed. And they did that on a local level. So focusing on not just the large areas, but also the local as well as the state and the national to get some of these issues. And it gets to my second point. These movements are very much now focusing on the roots of some of these systemic issues that we're dealing with. So we know that there are some issues historically we have to deal with. We have these systems of injustice. How do we get here and how do we readdress these? And we're now in a moment of reflection and reception where more people are receptive to what's happening, but also redress. How do we engage with these different initiatives to really think about how to dismantle these long-standing structures? So while toppling statues is nice and it's important, painting Black Lives Matter on the streets is nice, it's important, but what do we want to do to in some ways break the pipeline of the prison system? What do we want to do to address the health inequalities that led to communities of Black and brown people dying in unproportionate rates? How do we deal with the communities where there was a piece that came out in the LA Times recently? You have students in LA, Hispanic students are sitting in the parking lots of Panera to get free Wi-Fi because they can't do their work. They don't have Wi-Fi. So how do we address these issues and how do we deal with these issues? How do we get here and how do we in some ways move forward to have a better and more equitable society if that's what we want to have for and really think through it? And so how do we think about these particular moments? And we see this in the support other places as well, where we see different places in Europe, they're marching with the Black Lives Matter movement, but they're also saying we have our own problems too. Let's also deal with these moments ourselves. Let's use this moment to deal with what we're going through, the issues we have in our own particular nation states. And then also we think about the changes to the law. We know now that they have the new Hong Kong security law, and there's very clear language in that very much stipulates that if you have certain what they kind of consider foreign influence, whatever that may be, it's framed very vaguely. So they in some ways try to reach out and get endorsements or support. What does that mean for that particular movement? How do we in some ways combat this, where having that global support will be great, but how do we in some ways encourage it and reach out and get it in a way that's also not going to lead to us being penalized or imprisoned for simply just trying to protest for our right to have a greater sense of have a future for ourselves as Hong Kongers, and what that means for a future Hong Kong. So I'll leave it at that. I'll just kind of leave it on those particular points, but I just leave it at that and kind of think about China and Hong Kong, and think about the Black Lives Matter and Hong Kong protests, and maybe we can think about any of the questions you want to ask. And I covered a large swath of time and topics, but just anything people want to talk about, that you think about the past, the present, or even the future. How do we move forward in this moment, thinking about the future of kind of U.S.-China relations, China in the world, and how we engage with it, or even China-Africa, or China-U.S. and Africa as well. So I'll open it up to Kori, and then we'll go from there. So thank you for listening to my comments.
Thank you, Professor Brown. That was I really liked that lecture. I resonated a lot with things that you said, and so many questions I want to ask. But first, I think I want to kind of walk back to the beginning and ask a question that I get asked all the time, that, you know, it can be annoying, but then also, you know, it's a genuine question. People wonder, why to you does the history of Black engagement with China matter? What will this understanding allow people in the China space, or even if they're not in the China space, to better understand about, you know, the state of global relations today?
So thank you, and that's a really great question, and I get that a lot. I mean, when I first did my research, it was like, that's interesting, and I was like, no, but it's important too.
I agree. But I'm going to ask you anyway.
Had to fight, but it's a good question, because that happens. Thinking the question was, why do we care? Why should we think about it? And I think a recent piece I wrote for the Association of Black Women Historians, ABWH, they did a blog series on Black women in the archive, and how in some ways, how do we archive Black women? Are we in some ways included, excluded? How do we find Black women, or how are Black women treated when they try to do archival work? Because one contributor wrote about doing archival research in Latin America, and her experience in some ways trying to fight to actually navigate that space and be seen as a serious scholar, which is crazy to think about, but how to navigate those spaces. And so in that particular piece, I wrote about Unita Blackwell, who was known very much for her domestic politics. She did a lot of work in Mississippi. That's where she's from. She was very much into politics, but she also did a lot for U.S.-China relations. She started the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association. She went to China 18 times. She was in some ways this kind of unofficial ambassador for U.S.-China relations. And the U.S.-China People's Friendship Association was important because it made, it's a time when China was opened back up to the U.S. And it's like, how do we make the American population feel comfortable engaging with China? How do we in some ways make China, we go from this big red scary monster to all of a sudden they're our friend? How do we navigate that space and that process? And one way was through local organizations where they had lessons. They had, you can learn Chinese, you can have some cultural diplomacy. And it was also the way in which most Americans could actually go to China for the first time on these tours. I think one of the other lessons from this particular, for her narrative, is that the symbol we use today, the interlocking flags, was actually something that she put together, and it's still a symbol that we use today. And so I use those ideas to say, when we open it up to think about, go beyond what we call centering whiteness in Chinese foreign relations, we kind of see this larger, more holistic picture of Chinese foreign relations broadly. I think a lot of times I teach war history too. That's the one I usually teach, starts in 1500. And it's very much about, a critique our students have, as well as, like, we see the rise of European imperialism and the decline of Black and Brown people globally. What is happening? And so I think in many cases, that's what's happened with a lot of the scholarship in Chinese foreign relations. We center whiteness, we center relationships with either Europe or America, and not really thinking about the history prior to that moment, where you have trade was based in the Indian Ocean. It was Afro-Eurasian trade before the Atlantic became this new space. And so how we disengage that, we don't think about, the Ming Dynasty, Zheng He has voyages to Africa. You have a giraffe in the Chinese court that, Patricia Ebrey talks about in one of her textbooks about China. So there is an engagement there, and there's a lot of history, but a lot of times that the history gets lost. When we do that, we produce this very monochromatic understanding of China and who China engages with and what China is focused on. But if we open up to see China's engagement with other people, not just African Americans, but just the larger world in general, we get a better sense of what was China trying to do at pivotal moments. And for my research, thinking about the Maoist era, thinking about Chinese foreign relations, we kind of understand as well, we see the roots of China and Africa today. It's not new. A lot of this comes from that post-1949 moment where people like Du Bois are going, or you have Joe and Lai is making African, so he's on safaris in African nations. He's going on these tours all over the place to actively build relations with African nations. And these relationships ultimately to, China, the PRC itself being recognized by the UN as the body of China versus the Republic of China. And so it's like a lot of these collaborations and networks are very important, but if we don't really open that space up, we don't really see ways in which these histories and narratives really shape a lot of the history of the Chinese foreign relations. And so one of the things I want to do in my work is kind of thinking about and push for a decentering of whiteness in Chinese foreign relations, because it limits our understanding of what China was doing. It limits our understanding of what was happening, because at the period where a lot of African Americans are going to our study, it's a period in which Americans were not encouraged to go to China. So China is inviting Black people to China when Americans are not able to go. And so a lot of my research subjects are risking losing their citizenship, losing their passports, losing a lot to go to China in the midst of this height of the McCarthy, Red Scare era. So what are they risking to go, and why, and what does that mean for Chinese and U.S. relations, and also what's happening there? And one more point I mentioned is that we always talk about U.S.-China in terms of Nixon's visit in '72 and his successful visit. His visit was successful because of Robert F. Williams, a Black man who went with his family, and he lived in Beijing for 3 years with his family. And so he learned a lot about the kind of soft diplomacy side. So not just the politics and the talking, but how do you engage? How do you show respectful behavior in, say, a banquet setting? How do you show respectful behavior in these different settings? How do you in some ways engage with the cultural traditions to make that visit also successful? And he did that in exchange for his freedom, so that the FBI would drop the case against him. That's how the story.
No, I appreciate that story. I didn't know that story. That's very interesting. And, I wanted to connect with you on the point you'd made about Blackness looking a certain way, even to fellow Americans. I remember the first time I was studying abroad, I was in a program with other American students, and a guy kind of turned to me and was like, I think it's great. There's just like such a diversity of people in this program. So where are you from? And I was like, from America. And he was like, no, but where are you from? And I was like, no, I think he was just like kind of like a little bit interrogating, like, where was I from? And I was like, so there was slavery in America. And then, so I eventually was born, and thus I am both Black and American. I had to kind of so yeah, I bring that up though, because, it's interesting how there still seems to be a devaluing of diversity in general on sort of the international relations side, the international relations community in the US, in other Western countries. You could take France as another example. And I want to ask you, what do you think, and you've touched on this a bit, but just to maybe just say it very clearly, briefly, what do you think is lost in our attempts to negotiate global policy when we don't include African American or other Black people in the global leadership or in the diplomacy efforts?
Yeah. I think that's a great question. I know there is a lot of discussion going around in the IR circles, especially in the U.S. Department. I know they had a webinar, I think, talking about these issues. And I think they're trying to put forth some bills and other initiatives to kind of really address the diversity questions within the kind of global diplomacy space and recognizing it. I think there's a lot that's that diversity does. I think it's not just diversity, but also kind of equity and inclusion, because you can have a diverse space, but if the people who are in diverse spaces are not ones who are in some ways in positions to make a ton of long-term sustainable changes, then it's like diversity is great. You have people looking diverse, but what is the final say happening? Is it the same status quo with just new faces making the same decisions? So I think it has to be diversity, but also equity, and then also inclusion. Like, are you including those voices? And so if you have that, America, it promotes itself as being a very diverse space, a very inclusive space. And we have to say that if we are going to put this face out there, we have to really show that there are diverse perspectives that come from different people. And diversity doesn't have to necessarily be just racial diversity. It can be sexual diversity. You, in some ways, have these initiatives, have some events that talk about these different questions in different places. It can be religious diversity, but having that diversity, those plurality of voices, to really open up a question. Because if you ask a question and everyone has the same answer, then what are you getting? There's no real dialogue happening. Or if you don't understand different perspectives, then in some cases, you're not really being able to maybe connect with someone else on the other side of the table. You might not understand that particular perspective. I think one of the things that's happening recently, a lot of my colleagues in Asian studies and other people, I think, or not just Asian studies, but just some of my friends from college. I went to Notre Dame, and they had recently the Black alumni put together a petition to talk about lack of diversity on our own campus. And we had a lot of us wrote different posts on Facebook. And one of the things that happened was some of my friends from college were like, we were in college at the same time. I never knew this was going on. And I was like, but that was my experience. And I think a lot of times we don't open those up. We don't realize that there are so many different experiences that can lead to a different way of looking at these different questions and problems. How I might look at a question or issue based on my experiences might give me, maybe sometimes we call, quote unquote, this outside perspective, but nonetheless, it's one that is useful. And I think Kimberly Crenshaw's work on intersectionality really highlights that, how in these spaces, when you have different modes of operating, where especially as in particular Black women, where you have this kind of multiple oppression, how that leads you to see different issues from a different perspective than, say, someone who is not in that position. And it doesn't mean that you're right or wrong, your position is better or not, but it makes those decisions, it makes a discussion more informed and more fruitful to see it from multiple perspectives, to say, well, this is another way of looking at it, this is another looking at it, and maybe we can think about this problem in its totality versus just from the same perspective over and over again.
Thank you. And for people who may not be aware, Kimberly Crenshaw is a law professor at Columbia, my school, and she's been doing a lot of work recently talking about how are Black people faring during this pandemic, how are their needs being addressed or just not addressed. So definitely check out her work. But so we have a lot of great questions from the audience, and I want to kind of weave that into this conversation that we're building. So, one of the things that struck me when I was reading your article, Blackness in Exile, but also as you were speaking, was this history of Uncle Tom's Cabin in China and the remaining fascination with that text, but also what seems to be, and I'm going to dig into the performativity aspect of Blackness here in China, what seems to be a refusal to acknowledge perhaps some of the, you could call it Han chauvinism, we could just say like denial of racism or cultural racism, but yeah, a consistent denial of racism being a problem in just Chinese society. So to give some examples, there was outcry when in 2018 at the Spring Gala, an actress like dressed up in a monkey suit with a blackface and performed. There was another incident in 2016 where a company called Adobe, they had a Black man and an Asian woman put him in the washer machine. And then when he was done washing, a cute Asian boy came out. There was another incident where in promoting Star Wars, Disney, in collaboration with their China team, altered the poster to remove one of the Black actors that was prominently featured, and then make the other two actors of color that were also in the poster like significantly smaller. And then there's also most recently the pushback against Darlie changing their branding. And so for people who aren't familiar with that, it's a toothpaste brand that when I saw it, I kind of had to I walked past it and then I came back and I looked at it again. and I just couldn't, because what the face of it is a very dark-skinned man with large red lips and very white teeth. Like you can see all of them. And the idea is that, you know, like, whatever, I'm not gonna go all the way into it. But anyway, these things happen. And yet we haven't seen the same kind of dialogue about addressing racism in China as we've seen in the US recently. And I just, this is a long-winded way of asking you what your thoughts on that is. What explains the dissonance between this interest in things like Uncle Tom's Cabin and oppression narratives, and you know, whether you see it in film or in text, and the fact that we see all the time, though, that race is being performed, you know, Blackness is being performed by Asian actors in a way that is, you know, insulting or derogative and what have you.
So that's a really great question. I will say a footnote to the Dolly toothpaste. So Dolly is the new name. It used to be originally called Darky. The Chinese name is Black People's Toothpaste. And I will say the first time I saw it, it did throw me off for a second, but then I did a little bit of digging. So I realized that it actually was not originally a Chinese brand. It actually was a British Hong Kong brand. It was Hazel and Holly. And so the owners of it went to the US. They saw it in Al Jolson show. And if you don't know Al Jolson, he was known for kind of vaudeville blackface performances. He was not black, but he put on blackface to perform. And they said, his black face, his red lips will look great against white teeth to sell toothpaste. So that became the logo. And so it was in many ways the importation of a racist image without really explaining it, because there's no asterisk on the box says, by the way, this image is racist. It doesn't say that. It's this image. And so I remember the first time I saw it, I was like, it threw me off for a minute. It did, because I wasn't expecting that. No one told me that. I was expecting other things, but not that one. But I remember doing the research. I remember thinking, you know, when it was introduced, it was also became so popular in China because it was, you know, early 20th century. It was coming from Hong Kong, which is technically China, but at that time it was under British control. So it was seen as this kind of foreign product, and it was tied into ideas of modernity. And so the product itself became very popular. And by, you know, because of that, the image became popular. And in many cases, I'm not sure how much in China, people understood that image was a problematic image. It was very much like, this is a product is in some ways expensive. So, you know, it has a class level to it because it's a foreign product and it's hygienic modernity. We see this kind of discussion in the kind of studies as well. And so that toothpaste becomes part of this and that image becomes part of it as well. And I kind of go through that discussion because that's kind of the same thing that happened with kind of Uncle Tom's Cabin. These kind of very kind of stereotypical one dimension and not images produced by African Americans themselves become this introduction. And so how do we in some ways introduce Blackness through a Black person's perspective? And so that's where the visits such as Langston Hughes when he goes in the 30s is important. That's when, you know, Claude McKay's poem, If We Must Die, which I think is a beautiful poem. It's very like, you know, pro me, but it's very much about, you know, taking a stance about certain things. But that poem starts to become circulated as part of some of the language in the early kind of modern Chinese literature circles. And you have Black musicians who are traveling, who are playing in 1920s and 30s Shanghai, who will also in some ways bring a different perspective. And this kind of bringing another dimension to what Blackness is, and for African Americans continues post 1949. We have people like Du Bois who are going, and his wife, and Robert Williams and his wife and their two sons to go, and you have Vicki Garvin and others. So they bring a different level of, in some ways, a new understanding of Blackness beyond these perspectives that are introduced that are one dimensional and not produced by African Americans themselves. These kind of ascribed external identities that are very much racist become very much part of this way in which Black people are discussed. Why in some ways we still have that today, that becomes a larger the narrative of why have we not engaged with it. And I think for me, the frustration is if you look at the number of new institutes popped up, you know, in China to study China-African relations, there are numbers of them all over the place, but that language or the understanding is not trickling down. I'm not sure if it's only focused on all the political and the economic and not much of the cultural and social problems or issues that are rising now. So it's like they have a lot of this new resources devoted to studying China and Africa, but there's not a lot of changing perceptions at the non-academic spaces. It's not trickling down to where, as you mentioned, you have in the you know, the Chinese New Year celebration, this actress is in blackface and is saying, you know, I love China over and over. And it's like, this is what I'm trying to say here. So I think that level of trying to engage with the populace, it has to be something that happens and kind of trickle down. And it has to happen, I think, sometimes at both the local, through kind of local organizations, through local networks, or individuals who are trying to make those conversations happen. But also the state is going to also have to engage with it as well. If we're talking about more engagement with Africa and African nations through, you know, development, or through, you know, and think about the Belt and Road, we're going to have to address not just the economic and the political, but also address some of the social and cultural issues that are rising as well. How do we deal with what's happening on the ground in different places? Not just in China, we see, you know, the rise of this kind of, you know, huge anti-Black backlash in the, during the midst of COVID-19 that was happening. But there's also some antagonisms in places where you have huge Chinese and African populations and African nations as well. So they're going to have to address it on both sides and not just see that it's just this economic benefit, but what are we doing? And so I think that they're kind of addressing at the state level what is happening. And also some of these corporations that are doing engagement, if you're going to do development, you might need to have some kind of discussions at your corporate level. What are you doing? Are you just seeing these people as economic ends to means? And if so, then we need to talk about that too. That's the issue as well. And but also the local level. What are local individuals, institutions that are there to do the work to also try to mediate some of those problematic tensions? I think one of the highlights of our trip to Hong Kong was that we met with a young guy who has a nonprofit who's trying to do this in Hong Kong, where he's trying to do it through sports and through cultural events to kind of talk about the antagonisms in places like Hong Kong. And so that kind of local level, that individual also has a power too, because now you can in some ways put a face or a name to this larger issue of, well, although, you know, this issue of this, the other, their problems are happening because it's, you know, China has issues because they're developing African nations, it's their fault. Well, no, it breaks it down to, no, let's look at the individual too. So I think it has to be addressed at all these different levels, and it has to be some sustained, intense engagement, but I don't know who's going to start it where. That's the issue. What, you know, who in the State Department or, you know, in the Chinese Foreign Affairs Ministry is really going to try to engage that, or who are these different corporations who are going to invest in Africa, going to do that level of work. That's something they need to really think through.
Thank you for that. I have a follow question from the audience. So you talked about how China viewed Black Americans as an oppressed class, not necessarily as a distinct community. And I'm interested in how we got from the anti-colonial China that invites, you know, Langston Hughes and W.E.B. Du Bois and all of these other Black intellectual leaders in the 1960s and earlier. So obviously, Langston Hughes is not in the 60s, but I'm just covering the gamut of people who went before anyone tries to troll me. To how did we get from that to the washing machine commercial to, you know, the spring gala, and, you know, as you mentioned, the recent kind of, yeah, like the discriminatory treatment of Africans in provinces like Guangzhou?
So that's a good question, and that's something I'm always in some ways thinking through. And we think about the, especially in the height of, I think in the early 20s and 30s, where we're kind of, you know, China is no longer under this imperial system. We now are under the Republic of China, this kind of government. We're still trying to figure this out. And China is becoming this modern nation state, trying to figure out its identity. And some of the ways it does that is also looking at other different peoples and cultures who are doing the same thing. And so interesting to think that somehow the literature from the Harlem Renaissance is this piece, or kind of this set of literature that actually turned to this movement. But thinking through some of the ideas, because they link it by saying we're both in some ways groups who have been experienced colonial oppression in some shape or form. You all in the form of American imperialism, us in terms of how we see the results of the series of opium wars that led to, you know, this opening kind of very much forced kind of imperialism within China itself. And so we kind of see those linkages being made in kind of the 1920s and 30s. And it's very much about trying to find some way to have some kind of understanding of the world around us, how to form identity, and how the national identity becomes in some ways, it comes in some ways trying to figure this out. They somehow in some ways think to try to look to African Americans in some of this literature that's coming out in some interesting ways, which I was like, really? Okay, this is kind of cool. And then we kind of have in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s is very much about trying to promote the new China. And so we have people like Mao Zedong, who's like, this is the new China, and he's inviting not just African Americans, but African Americans who have a particular level of clout. So Du Bois has a large, he has a large standing globally. People in America know him. He has a large following in Afro-Asian communities, and they're trying to promote the new China to Africa. As we've seen his speech, China and Africa 1959, given at Beijing University, where he's very much talking about China look to Africa. I mean, Africa look to China as this model of, what you can do as this new kind of independent post-colonial moment. And so they're using some of these individuals to kind of promote the new China, what they're writing about, what they're seeing, to kind of get this message out. And then we kind of have this where it's very political. They're trying to really think through some of these navigations and things. And then we kind of see that switch, and in many cases, is kind of aligned with Nixon's vision in 1972, the idea of going with more mainstream American politics, having more mainstream American relations, how in some ways aligning with some of these radical groups or radical individuals. I don't see how they say Du Bois as an 80, 90-year-old man is radical, but I love it. But it's very radical groups and different ideas, and thinking about how move from those narratives to moving to more mainstream narratives, and how we see that happen. That's one big shift. I think the second big shift is we think about kind of the kind of globalization. China opens up, falls into, and starts to engage with the market. We start to see kind of globalization in these one-dimensional kind of pop cultural references of Black culture. So you start to see, rap music becomes emblematic of all Black culture, or you start to see random B films. I remember the first time I went in college, and I'm not gonna age myself, don't age me. But I remember Desperate Housewives was big. Yes, I'm old. But I remember Desperate Housewives was huge. And I remember on that show, if you remember, they only had, I think up until this point, they were the first time they had a Black family, was like, season 5 or something. And it was Alfred Wood and her 2 sons, and she was a classical pianist. But her one son killed somebody, the other son was locked up in the basement. And I was like, what kind of but that was, the show was problematic in and of itself. And then they kind of tried to recuperate by bringing Vanessa Williams the last season. But I was like, I get the show, all the characters had some kind of backstory, but I was like, there's too much going on. Like, this is not, it's in a lot of the B films that were going around with, like, these kind of movies that were not mainstream American movies, but they were like, made for straight for DVD, and they were getting put out there in bootleg. And it was like, the very stereotypical Black folks as gangsters or drug dealers. And I was like, I'm neither one of those things. How do I navigate this space? And then when Tyler Perry's Medea movies made it across the pond, I said, I give up. I can't do it. I mean, I remember one time, the day I saw, I remember the day they came out, the Trayvon, the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin, the court decisions came out. I was actually in China, and for some reason that day they were playing Norbert dubbed over in Chinese, and I was like, I'm overwhelmed today between this and Norbert on TV. It's too much happening. But we kind of see in many ways this kind of circulation of these kind of pop culture or kind of images of Blackness that kind of start to really take away that kind of larger trying to understand what's happening. It's like, no, this is cool, this looks accessible, this is nice. And it's not just in China. I mean, you have it in places like Japan, where some people are trying to tan their skin, they're trying to put cornrows in their hair, they think it looks something that's cool to in some ways wear, but not really knowing the history, the legacies behind those. And so I think that kind of shift towards kind of more thinking about the 1972 visit, but also the idea of how we see kind of different global currencies and pop culture circulating, that also leads to it as well. So now we have the rise of what basketball is not big, and we have people like Stephon Marbury is huge in China, and I'm like, that's cool, but what is that going to do in terms of thinking about Blackness? Because you have him there, but also recently Popeyes opened up. So now you have Popeyes in China. And I'm just like, I don't know how to handle both of these.
Right.
It's interesting to see how they're marketing Popeyes. Is it the same Black woman in the US? And if so, there's some problems with that. We're going to deal with it. But how are they kind of thinking through, and how is in some ways this globalization has led to these one-dimensional depictions, again, of Black people, and how there's not a lot of engagement beyond that to really see this is just something that you can see and can be gimmicky, but not really knowing, say, the history behind rap music. So you get the popular culture songs that are like the top 40. Are you also getting some of the more nuanced songs, some of the ones of people who are doing more kind of using their music as a platform of protest? Are you getting that level of dissemination as well? Are you seeing some collaboration between, say, Chinese artists and Black? Like, where is that connect coming from? Is it just something to emulate because it sounds or looks cool?
Well, I see that we're basically at time, but I want to get in one last question from the audience. Richard Haddock, I think you have a question you want to ask. Do you want to jump in?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Brown, for speaking with us today. I know I certainly learned a lot myself, including digging more into the Nixon visit and everything that helped make that possible. So thank you for those perspectives. I work at George Washington University, and I wanted to ask for research and educational institutions, what do you see are successful programs or strategies to highlight the multitude of voices in the Asian studies and China space in particular? And I'm also interested in multi-nation states and how China can be studied in those terms. And if you find that what has been the evolution of narrative for marginalized communities in the states in addressing the marginalized communities in the China space. And I have some sympathies to this because my family is from Puerto Rico, and that the complicated history between the island and the US has led me to give me a different or special vector of empathy and sympathy for Taiwan, for instance, and other elements in the China space conversation. So I wanted to also just get your take on, with all the complex political issues and authoritarian issues that China is going through regarding its own marginalized communities, how do you see that evolution taking place? Thanks so much.
Thank you for those questions. So in thinking about research, education institutions, and some of the programs and strategies, I think one thing that we can do at the professor level is to think about what we're going to include in our syllabi. So I think one of the really great feedback that I've gotten from the Teaching China Through Black History Fairbank blog post is that many other scholars who teach Chinese history were like, I didn't even know these resources are out there. And so they're going to include some of those in their modern Chinese history discussions or thinking about their Chinese history courses. And so even that simple, just making a few modifications or tweaking on your syllabus is something that different professors can do in terms of their own way of how to expand the particular curriculum, still meet the learning outcomes or objectives of your course or your program, but thinking about other readings that can do that expand students' understanding discussion of modern China in some ways. I think another initiative will be to have maybe some more programs and initiatives. I know it's hard to do that on campus right now. Everything's on Zoom, and Zoom fatigue is real. So not want to overwhelm students, but maybe having, different discussions and perspectives, or even just, having those moments of, let's highlight something this particular month or this semester and have an event around campus that opens up some of these spaces. And I really think that students are receptive, because when I was on postdoc fellowship leave at Emory, we had to teach one course, and I taught the course in the spring. As a result, I had some really great students in my class who represented two organizations on campus. One was the Black Student Union, and the other was the Asian Pacific Islander Student Organization. And they put together themselves a whole discussion about, thinking about addressing anti-Blackness or addressing some of these issues within the different communities, or addressing racism in our communities. And it was just the kind of organic outgrowth of their interest, where they had someone who was willing to have those discussions and make yourself willing and available. Like, I do want to have these discussions, and that could be something as well. I think another initiative we think about, and this is something that I really applaud the Group Asian Network for, is that they have a consultancy program where they reach out to other universities. And so they actually reached out to us at Tennessee State to really think about, building or thinking through what would an Asian Studies program look for us at HBCU. And so thinking about those pipeline issues of, where are these particular programs? Do we have more of those? And how can we, at the institutional level, support other universities, not just HBCUs, and maybe another MSI, minority service institution that George Washington that you work with. It might be another local university. That might be useful to have some kind of connections or working with them as well, to have some kind of joint initiatives, but using your institutional weight and support to say, we also want to support you as you're trying to also do some of these things, or have some collaborations that can be really effective and really, you got to, really kind of bringing some bridges together to work together to do some different issues that way. I think it also a really great place to think about is Christine Yana, who is the current president of the Association for Asian Studies, really put out a really good piece today, thinking about what organizations like AAS can do, and thinking about their role as well. So also thinking about if your membership or organization you're a part of, holding them to task about what they're doing and not doing in terms of initiatives, to think about how do we have more and kind of think about inclusive programs and what do we mean by these initiatives. So I think those are some different ways to maybe think about it, both at your individual level, but also maybe at the institutional level and even at the larger organization level of institutions and organizations you're a part of, to really put some ideas out there and ask them to kind of hold them to task. But I think her piece today was really interesting in thinking about, we are an organization, but what we want to do about these issues, and can we still in some ways stay on the sideline, and if not, here's why. And it might be a nice template to put forth to your program and say, we need to in some ways do some similar issues as well as what they're trying to do here, this larger organization. And thinking about the multinational states, I don't know what I'm talking about. I'm thinking about your other part and thinking about marginalized communities and how that would be another way of thinking through and working through that. I don't really have a full direct answer for you on that one. I'm sorry. I wish I had a better answer. I know a lot of, I think most of my work is more about looking at the individual and thinking about transnational, not necessarily looking at state to state. That's why I use transnational and thinking through these ideas, but I think a lot of really good transnational scholarship might be useful. I think a text that might be useful is in Marla Garland's book, thinking about the transnational South, and thinking through that work might be a really good piece of maybe beginning, and how she thinks through this idea of looking at these kind of marginalized and how do we go from there. And her global South does include places in South America as well. And so she looks at this larger way of thinking through transnationalism in that way. So that's why I can kind of leave you as a starting point, but I don't really have another fully fledged answer for you. But it is a question I will kind of think about and think through, really consider. So thank you for that question. Whew. All right, I am talked out.
Well, we are about 10 minutes over, so I'll jump in and be the bad guy, because I know that Kori has been leading a wonderful discussion, and I want to thank her for leading this. Professor Brown, I want to thank you for taking the time out of your evening and sharing it with us and sharing your expertise. And I also want to thank everyone who's come and joined. We had a really great discussion. We had a lot of questions coming in through the chat box, and thank you, Richard, for putting your face out there and your voice to the question as well. I really appreciate that. And hopefully we will all be able to get together in New York and in Washington, D.C., respectively, in a very short amount of time. I look forward to seeing you all again and in person. But in the meantime, please sign up for Young China Watchers at youngchinawatchers.com/join. You follow Kori on Twitter at Cooper_Esquire or BLK on China, right? BLK Voice on China to follow her project Black Voices on Greater China. You can also find Keisha Brown on Twitter as well. And I highly recommend you following all the great things that she's doing and learning a lot more. Please reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions. I'll try to facilitate
real quick.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm on Twitter at .kbrown85, but also to other organizations that you can also get more information is the Black China Caucus, as well as NABIA, which is the National Association for Black Engagement with Asia. So these are other places where you can learn more about these topics as well. So my last little plug. So thank you, Will. Sorry about that.
No, perfect. That's, big shout out to Black Voices, Black China Caucus, and stay tuned to hear more about that. Thank you all. Have a wonderful rest of your Tuesday evenings.
Thank you.
Thank you. 再见.
Thank you. Good job.